Alex, and our today's story starts where the shadows tell their secrets and the silence hides something far more sinister. Tonight, we journey into a forest that time forgot, a place where the past never stays buried, and the whispers in the wind aren't just a figment of your imagination. So, get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and let's dive into tonight's tale. Echoes in the Woods. They always said not to go into the woods past sundown. Every town has its myths, stories of haunted places where unexplainable things happen. For Lucas, that place was the old forest on the outskirts of their small village. His grandmother had called it the Hollow, a name spoken only in whispers, as though even mentioning it too loudly would wake whatever lurked there. But Lucas wasn't the superstitious type. He'd spent years hearing the tales from the old-timers, people disappearing, strange lights at night, voices in the wind. None of it fazed him. Myths, he thought. Stories meant to keep children from wandering off and getting lost. On the evening of his 27th birthday, after a few drinks at the local pub, Lucas decided it was time to prove the legends wrong. His friends laughed, jokingly daring him to go deep into the hollow. "Just don't get lost in there like the others," they teased. The alcohol gave him courage, and with a smirk he accepted the challenge. The forest stood waiting, dark and silent under the crescent moon. With a flashlight in hand, Lucas pushed through the underbrush, the trees quickly closing in around him. The dense canopy blocked out the moonlight, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. As he walked deeper, the usual sounds of the forest faded away. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, gone. An unnatural stillness settled over everything. The deeper he went, the thicker the silence grew, until it felt suffocating. Even the crunch of twigs beneath his boots seemed swallowed up by the trees. But Lucas wasn't afraid. Not yet. An hour in, and the path he'd been following disappeared entirely. The trees seemed to press closer together, their trunks knotted and twisted in impossible shapes, their branches like bony fingers reaching toward him. A creeping unease began to gnaw at the back of his mind. He wasn't lost, was he? It had all felt so straightforward at first. He paused to get his bearings, the beam of his flashlight darting across the towering trees. That's when he noticed it. The air had grown colder, unnaturally so. His breath came out in frosty puffs, despite it being late summer. And then, faintly at first, he heard something. A soft rustling, not from the trees but from behind him. Footsteps. Too deliberate, too slow. They were following him. Lucas spun around, flashing the light into the dark. But there was nothing there. Only trees. Still, the sound continued, one step at a time, echoing his own pace. "Hello?" Lucas called out, his voice breaking the eerie silence. No response. He quickened his pace, determined to shake off the creeping dread that was crawling up his spine. But the footsteps matched him, always just a step behind. No matter how fast he moved, they never fell out of sync. And with each step, they grew heavier, more deliberate, as if whatever was following him wanted to be heard. The trees thinned out ahead, and Lucas felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he was nearing the edge of the forest, the boundary he'd heard of but never seen. But as he reached the clearing, he stopped in his tracks. There, standing in the center of the opening, was something. A figure. It stood motionless, facing him. Its shape was indistinct, shrouded in darkness, as though it was part of the shadows themselves. The moonlight should have illuminated its features, but instead, the light seemed to bend around it, refusing to touch whatever it was. For a moment, Lucas stared, heart hammering in his chest, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, as though examining him. And then, slowly, it raised one hand, a long, thin arm that stretched out unnaturally toward him. Without thinking, Lucas stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure remained still, its arm still outstretched, as if beckoning him forward. But Lucas had no intention of obeying. He turned and ran, the sound of footsteps following close behind him now, no longer slow and deliberate. They were fast, too fast, as if whatever was following him no longer cared about keeping its presence a secret. His breath came in ragged gasps, heart pounding in his chest as he dodged between the trees. The flashlight flickered, threatening to go out, casting the woods in brief flashes of light and shadow. In those moments of darkness, Lucas swore he saw movement, flickers of shapes darting between the trees, always just out of sight. The whispers began next. Low and barely audible at first, like the wind rustling through the leaves, but soon they grew louder, clearer. Voices, dozens of them, overlapping and intertwining, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. And then, cutting through the chaos, one voice stood out. A familiar one. Lucas. His heart nearly stopped. It was his grandmother's voice, clear, unmistakable. But that was impossible. She had passed away years ago. Lucas, come closer. The voice whispered again, closer this time, as if it was coming from right behind him. He didn't dare turn around. Instead, he pushed forward, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness. But no matter how far he ran, the footsteps never faded. They grew louder, closer, as if the whole forest had come alive, chasing him. The ground beneath him shifted suddenly, and Lucas felt his foot catch on something. A root, a rock, he didn't know. He fell hard, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and skidding across the ground. It landed several feet away, its beam casting long shadows that danced between the trees. He scrambled to his feet, but before he could reach for the light, he saw it, directly in the beam of the flashlight, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. The figure. But it wasn't alone this time. Dozens of figures stood with it now, all facing him, their forms shifting and pulsing in the moonlight as if they were part of the forest itself. Their faces, if they had faces, were hidden in the shadows, but he could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. Lucas took a step back, his mind racing. The whispers surrounded him now, louder, more insistent, calling his name over and over again. And then, without warning, everything went silent. The figures didn't move, didn't speak. The only sound was Lucas's own ragged breathing. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, locked in a tense standoff. And then, one by one, the figures began to fade, dissolving into the darkness as though they had never been there. Lucas didn't wait to see if they would return. He grabbed the flashlight and ran, not stopping until he burst out of the forest and into the safety of the village. Breathless and trembling, he collapsed on the ground, the eerie silence of the forest still echoing in his ears. He looked back, half expecting to see the figures standing at the tree line, watching him, but there was nothing. Nothing but the memory of the voices.